Oké, de meeste mensen hebben een stoel gevonden. Welkom vandaag bij het Nationaal Congres Opendata Eindhoven. Dit wordt georganiseerd door het platform Opendata Eindhoven. En we willen vandaag een veelzijdig en boeiende dag van maken. Waarin u vooral leert ook hoe we met de praktijk om kunnen gaan. Daarom heet het Make It Work. De dagvoorzitter vandaag is Paul Suikerbak. Bezig met de landelijke ontwikkeling van allerlei open data programma's. En de opening wordt gedaan door de wethouder Schreurs.
Goedemorgen. Ik doe dit omdat ik ook wethouder ben van Innovatie, naast een aantal andere dingen. Ik begin maar meteen met iets wat ik anders altijd vergeet. Dit gebeurt dankzij de dag en nacht inzet van René Paré en Mirjam Murray. Dus applaus. Graag. En even voor de helderheid, die behoren niet tot de gemeente Eindhoven. En dat is waar het tegenwoordig om gaat. Ik zal u niet lastigvallen met uw eigen inhoud, want die kent u wel. Maar wel van waarom het nou belangrijk is om het überhaupt te doen. Ik kan u feliciteren, want u leeft in ongelooflijk mooie tijden. Sommige mensen hebben er een andere mening over, maar het is echt geweldig. Wij leven namelijk in de eindtijd van het modernisme en het begin van de echte nieuwe tijd. Het modernisme kwam op na de Tweede Wereldoorlog, had allemaal prachtige idealen, maar het model was de fabriek. Het maakte niet uit wat voor werk je deed. Je werd gezien als een object dat een onderdeeltje was van het systeem en daarin deed je je eigen werk. Het werkte ook zo voor de mensen die het ongeluk hadden om in het systeem terecht te komen. Of het nou onderwijs was, gezondheidszorg, you name it. Allemaal geweldige idealen, maar je werd gereduceerd tot een ding. Daar word je niet gelukkig van. Daar word je niet gelukkig van als professional, daar word je niet gelukkig van als degene die het overkomt, maar vooral het werkt niet. Het doet geen recht aan waar mensen behoefte aan hebben. Mensen leven namelijk in één ongedeelde werkelijkheid. En ze hebben geen behoefte aan iets wat zegt van, oh weet je wat, we halen uit het systeem even de gezondheid en dan zijn we daarmee bezig. En we kijken niet naar hoe zich dat verhoudt met de rest van jouw wereld. En als professional heb je er al helemaal geen behoefte aan dat jij gereduceerd wordt tot dat ene stukje waar je je opleiding in hebt gehad, maar waar je al die andere dingen en al die andere mensen die je kent niet in kunt gebruiken. Zonde. En nu wordt het anders. En waarom? Nou, als altijd, dankzij de technologie. Mensen veranderen niet zoveel in hun behoeftes. Maar afhankelijk van de tijd kunnen dingen wel of kunnen dingen niet. En het gebeurt nu dankzij de ICT en het net. Want als je uit wil gaan van een geïntegreerde werkelijkheid, dan betekent het dat je een ongelooflijk hoeveelheid data bij elkaar moet zien te fietsen. Om een voorbeeld te geven, hier in Eindhoven zijn we bezig met innovatie en zorg. Het is niet anders dan dat je zegt, goh, mensen willen eigenlijk niet zorg ontvangen, mensen willen gewoon hun leven leiden. En kunnen we dat organiseren? U kent vast de voorbeelden. Door mensen thuis te laten en te zorgen dat online hun bloeddruk gemeten wordt en ze kunnen converseren met het ziekenhuis, met hun dokter, met iedereen. In het leven van die mensen betekent dat opeens dat ze niet meer de hele tijd bezig zijn zich aan te passen aan de organisaties, de hele tijd onderweg zijn, de hele tijd hun transport moeten regelen, moeten wachten enzovoort. Het wordt gedaan samen met hen, in overleg met hen, op momenten dat het gewoon in het totaal goed gaat. Als je ernaar kijkt, dan zie je meteen wat er gebeurt. Het zijn vaak mensen van boven de 70, 80. Die mensen krijgen hun leven opeens terug. En ze krijgen het echt terug, omdat de structuur die ze gebruiken meteen zorgt dat ze hun sociale leven terugkrijgen. Want hetzelfde systeem wat je gebruikt voor conversatie met je arts, is het systeem wat je gewoon gebruikt voor conversatie met je omgeving. En in de eerste instantie is het hier uitgeprobeerd voor allochtone ouderen van Turkse afkomst. En die skypen dus met Turkije. Het is dus simpel. Je doet recht aan mensen. Je gaat echt maatwerk leveren. Je gaat echt zorgen dat ze een co-creator kunnen zijn van hun eigen leven. Maar het is een godschuwelijk moeilijk proces, omdat je echt alles bij elkaar moet brengen. Deze hele organisatie is bijvoorbeeld niet zo georganiseerd. Dat is allemaal zo. Dus nu moet opeens alles met elkaar om iets heen samenwerken. Een lastige opgave. Volgens mij wordt daar direct nog een vraag over gesteld hoe je dat moet doen. Maar het is wel mooi. Want of je het nou ervaart dat je je leven terugkrijgt, of dat je er nou als professional mee bezig bent, hier word je echt gelukkig van. Want dit zijn de dingen die ertoe doen. Waar u mee bezig bent, dat illustreert dan ook dat als je dan toch denkt in andersoortige systemen, als je dan toch die fabriek verlaten hebt, dan denk je ook meteen niet meer in het top-down systeem. Je had zo'n prachtige reclame waarin je zag dat iemand de hele tijd zo allerlei mensen aan een touwtje had. Dat doe je dus niet meer. Net zoals je wil dat de professionals van je eigen organisatie vooral in staat worden gesteld maximaal gebruik te maken van alle kennis en kunde die ze maar kunnen mobiliseren, in hunzelf of erbuiten, wil je natuurlijk dat überhaupt je het samen met de wereld creëert. Wij zien onszelf niet meer als degene die in staat is om eigenstandig en alleen de dingen te doen die nodig zijn. Wij zien wel een speciale rol voor ons. De eerste rol is gewoon het borgen van het publieke belang. Want dat is door u allemaal bij ons neergelegd. En het andere is organiseren dat dingen bij elkaar komen. Maar wat we dan willen organiseren is vooral dat al die dingen die buiten gebeuren ook een onderdeel kunnen zijn van wat wij zelf aan het organiseren zijn. Eigenlijk komt het erop neer dat op het moment dat we met iets bezig zijn, dat we vooral analyseren met iedereen. Wat is er nou precies aan de hand? En welke verbindingen moeten gemaakt worden en wat moet er gedaan worden? En hoe kunnen we het tot een open systeem maken, zodat er altijd nieuwe dingen aan toegevoegd kunnen worden? Door wie dan ook. De essentie daarvan is natuurlijk wel dat het om open systemen gaat. Dus open source, open data. Maar ja, daar heeft u natuurlijk veel meer verstand van dan ik. Mijn verwachtingen van u zijn groot. Wat u van mij mag vragen, en volgens mij van elke bestuurder in Nederland, om te zorgen dat wij het mogelijk maken. We zijn met z'n allen puzzelstukjes. En met elkaar kunnen we een hele mooie nieuwe puzzel maken. Het is een rare puzzel, want hij is nooit af. Maar het is wel een betere puzzel dan in het verleden. Zoals ik al zei, wij leven in hele mooie tijden.
Dankjewel, Miriam. Nou ja, goed, voordat ik mijn taak als dagvoorzitter verder opgepakt, wil ik je wel eigenlijk 2 vragen stellen. Dat had je net al aangekondigd ook. Vraag 1 is eigenlijk, waar ligt de primaire driver om vanuit de overheid dit proces van die verandering aan te sturen? En hoe ga je dat organiseren binnen de gemeente? Dat vind ik wel een interessante vraag, van hoe kun je dat hele proces van die verandering aansturen vanuit een overheidsorganisatie?
Moeilijk. De primaire driver is dat het ertoe doet. De dingen die ermee gedaan worden, die zijn belangrijk in het leven van mensen. Dus daarom moeten wij dat doen. En op het moment dat het onze primaire taak is, dan moeten wij het vooral ook mogelijk maken. Hoe je het dan organiseert binnen je gemeente is door het buiten jezelf neer te leggen, in alle eerlijkheid. Dus wij als gemeente zijn niet zo vreselijk goed in de uitvoering. En dat zie je, dus, want deze dag is vooral ook van buiten getrokken. En dan gaat het op een hele andere manier, dan wordt het ook veel informeler. Bij ons is het vooral dan altijd dat het ook in stukken afgekaart moet worden. Wij zijn ervan dat we gewoon zorgen dat die ruimte, dat het allemaal geïmplementeerd kan worden, dat die gegeven wordt. Dus wij zijn voor de regelgeving, zorgen dat de financiële structuren goed bij elkaar zijn, lobbyen dat er vooral allerlei dingen ook nog mogelijk zijn. Dus eigenlijk zorgen wij er gewoon voor dat de context gecreëerd wordt waarin het allemaal kan gebeuren. En ook dat wij zelf onze financiële stromen op een andere manier inzetten.
Komt er eigenlijk op neer dat ook de markt dus gewoon gevraagd wordt om hier gewoon deel in te nemen en te participeren om dit veranderingsproces voor elkaar te krijgen?
Ja. Misschien kan ik het gewoon, het model dat wij op dit moment erg aanlokkelijk vinden is het model van de coöperatie. Ik heb nu net eentje gelanceerd en dat was slim leven. Dat heeft gewoon, je moet vooral zorgen dat mensen zich verenigen gefocust op een bepaald onderwerp. Nou, hier is het dus gefocust op zorg. Vooral voorkomen van problemen rondom zorg en zorgen dat mensen daadwerkelijk beter gaat. En daar zit dan de hele wereld in, maar dan wel met die focus op zorg. Dus woningbouwcoöperatie zit erin, allerlei bedrijfsleven zit erin, kennisinstellingen van VMBO tot de universiteit zit erin, in verband met doorgaande leerlijnen. Dus je moet wel vooral goed weten waar je mee bezig bent, waarop je met elkaar wil samenwerken, want anders verzuip je gewoon in de mogelijkheden. Dat brengt me trouwens op iets anders. Wij hadden eventjes een voorgesprekje. Wij zijn bezig hier met de bibliotheek eigenlijk van de toekomst te creëren. En de echte opgave zit daar ook weer in de informatie zo van waarom zijn de bibliotheek nou zo succesvol geweest? Omdat je daar al informatie kon vinden. Nou, we weten tegenwoordig vind je daar de informatie niet. Maar de informatie die er is, wordt op dit moment absoluut niet ontsloten. Dus een van de dingen waar wij het over hadden is, met die informatie wil je dat je het kunt vinden, dat je weet of het waar is en dat je het kunt duiden. Dat gaat voor alle informatie en de data, de open data waar jullie mee bezig zijn, is daar natuurlijk gewoon een heel belangrijk onderdeel van. Want daar moet je altijd op terug kunnen grijpen op het moment dat je zegt van, oh misschien hadden we er toch andere bewerkingen mee moeten doen om te kijken van of het werkt of niet. Dus ja.
Volop kansen in ieder geval voor samenwerking denk ik met markt en overheid.
Nou, ik zou dus wel geïnteresseerd zijn als uit deze dag ook een begin kwam met zo'n samenwerkingsverband. Op bijvoorbeeld bepaalde onderwerpen. En dat je ze dan later aan elkaar kunt klikken nog in een groter geheel. Maar het moet wel ergens beginnen.
Even gelijk een vraag met een handopsteker. Wie is hier van markt? De markt, niet van de overheid? Kijk eens, dat doet mij dan deugd. Dat is dan toch een behoorlijke vertegenwoordiging. Ja, volgens mij een prima uitgangspunt inderdaad om... dan ga ik er even heel erg vanuit dat de rest van de overheid is trouwens. Is dat waar? Is er iemand die geen markt, geen overheid is? Burgers, er zijn welkom burgers. Welkom burgers. Goed, dankjewel voor je tijd. Ik heb begrepen dat je nu heel snel door moet naar een Chinese delegatie.
Ja.
Ga je het met hen ook hebben over Opendata? Of,
Nou, over innovatie omdat dat is ook zoiets aardigs. Wat we hier proberen te doen is het lichtgrid, het duurzame lichtgrid in de grond te krijgen. En dat betekent dat het niet alleen energetisch moet kloppen, maar dat je ook voor moet zorgen dat allerlei informatiesystemen erop komen rond luchtkwaliteit, maar ook bijvoorbeeld de verkeersregelinstallaties, de wifi, dus feitelijk het communicatiesysteem van de openbare ruimte. Ja. Wij weten trouwens nog niet wij weten niet precies hoe we dat moeten doen. Dus op het moment dat mensen daar ideeën over hebben,
oproep bij deze, meld u. Goed, Miriam, dankjewel. Oké, super, leuk, dankjewel. Goed, welkom. Het is al eerder door René Paré aangegeven. Deze dag gaan we met elkaar doormaken op het gebied van open data. Eigenlijk wilde ik even starten met, ik ben dan Paul Suikerbuik. Ik werk als projectleider voor data.overheid.nl in opdracht van het ministerie van Binnenlandse Zaken. Wat doe ik daar? Ik doe eigenlijk twee dingen. Enerzijds ben ik ervoor aan het zorgen dat de vindbaarheid van open data van de Nederlandse overheid groter wordt. Dat betekent dat datasets geregistreerd worden in data.overheid.nl en daarmee ook centraal op één locatie vindbaar worden. Dat de herbruikbaarheid van die data natuurlijk ligt bij overheidsorganisaties en bij marktpartijen. Dat is natuurlijk een heel ander verhaal. Dus die data ligt nog steeds verspreid door den landen. Goed, Dat is even mijn vertrekpunt. Ik zou het dus ook heel tof vinden als er gewoon regelmatig mensen naar me toe komen en zeggen van, joh, ik heb nog wat data liggen. Registreer dat even voor me. Nou, dan doe ik dat graag. Dus wat dat betreft bij deze de oproep aan iedereen om zijn data die hij heeft vooral ook even langs te brengen. Goed, er zijn veel dingen gebeurd afgelopen jaar op het gebied van data. Ik kan me nog een aantal... Als ik even terugkijk op een jaar, wie was hier vorig jaar in Eindhoven? Ja, dat is een redelijk bescheiden aantal handen. Dat is gaaf, want dat betekent dat er dus nieuwe mensen... Er zijn ook wel mensen afgevallen, denk ik dan. Goed, dat kan ook gebeuren. Maar die zijn dus, denk ik, thuis gewoon heel hard met data bezig. Dus dat is niet erg. Die zijn allemaal met het goede woord bezig verder. Maar ook weer een nieuwe groep mensen. En ik merk ook dat vanuit andere invalshoeken data interessant wordt. Gisteren heb ik een workshop gedaan voor Opendata en voorlichting vanuit de Rijksoverheid. En dan zie je dat er opeens een hele andere doelgroep opstaat en die zich ook met open data gaat bemoeien. En die eigenlijk dat heel ingewikkeld vinden. Nog daar staan waar wij misschien met elkaar 2 jaar geleden stonden, of een jaar geleden. Die nu heel erg aan het nadenken zijn van ja, maar data, wat is dan data? Wat betekent dat dan? En zijn het nou bitjes en bytes? Zijn het beleidsstukken of zijn het gestructureerde databases waar we het dan over hebben? Dus die vraagstukken die leven daar heel erg. En die vragen zich ook af, en wat voor rol speel ik dan vervolgens daarin in die ontsluiting naar de buitenwereld toe? Er waren zelfs mensen die verbaasd waren over het feit dat allerlei beleidsnotities op een gegeven moment ook via een open datakanaal naar buiten toe gingen. En dat ze daar helemaal niet naar gekeken hadden. Dus er ging een hele informatiestroom naar de buitenwereld toe, zonder dat hun voorlichtingsdiscipline er ook maar enige blik op geworpen had. Nou kun je zeggen dat er in een jaar veel gebeurt. Eigenlijk gebeurt er in een week al heel veel op het gebied van open data. En dan wil ik even een paar dingen naar voren halen die mij opgevallen zijn. Is dat de gemeente Alkmaar. Is er iemand van de gemeente Alkmaar? Nee, hè? Maar die jongens die hebben inmiddels wel gewoon een open dataportaal uit de grond getimmerd. Vond ik geweldig. Die hebben zich nog nooit ergens gemeld, zijn nog nooit bij me langs geweest, hebben nooit gevraagd hoe het moet. Die hebben een beetje rondgekeken op andere portalen. Een paar voorbeelden hebben ze opgepakt als Enschede en Nijmegen. En die dachten, ja, kunnen we ook. Die zijn helemaal niet moeilijk gaan doen, die zijn het gewoon gaan doen. En die hebben daarbij gekeken naar data.overheid.nl. Van wat is nou die definitie, hebben ze daar vandaan geplukt. En volgens mij hebben ze daar gewoon in een week, 2 weken, hebben ze die informatie bij elkaar geharkt. Het kan dus heel goed. Iets anders wat gebeurt deze week is dat Enschede. Gelukkig zijn er wel mensen uit Enschede. Willen de Enschede'ers dan een handen omhoog steken? Ja, welkom. Daar zie ik Patrick. Die heeft vanochtend speciaal zijn blauwe overhemd nog opgezocht, zag ik. Goed. Tim Berners-Lee. Dan praten we niet over, in dit geval heeft hij iets gezegd over niet heel erg open data, maar wel over het feit dat mensen het recht hebben om hun data terug te krijgen. Facebook, hij vindt van joh, Facebook moet nu al mijn data teruggeven. Ik heb daar recht op, het is mijn data. Dus die gaat daar heel erg op hameren dat het gevoel omtrent data en het eigenaarschap van data, dat gaat veranderen. Daar gaan we iets van vinden. Er wordt nu nog heel licht over nagedacht en dat gaat een slag maken. Vanochtend op de radio ook HumanNet. Ik weet niet of iemand naar de radio geluisterd heeft vanochtend. Schijnt dat dat portaal wat gebruikt wordt door de arbeidszorg, bedrijfsartsen, precies, dat daar van een heel groot aantal mensen dus gewoon de data vrij beschikbaar is. Niet bedoeld is open data, maar omdat ze gewoon een fout hebben gemaakt in een systeem. En die fout zit er al jaren in. Dus dat had al lang opgelost moeten zijn. En dat is het niet. Maar daar zie je nu dus, dit gaat een staartje krijgen. Ik geloof dat vanavond dat er een uitzending is van Zembla, waarin dat naar voren zal komen. Dus je praat er niet over open data, je praat wel over data en de consequenties van data. Er gebeurt ook heel veel op het gebied van big data. Dat vinden we dan ook opeens heel erg belangrijk. En wat is dan de relatie tussen open data en big data? Daar hoor je heel veel mensen over, ja, big data is open data. Dat is dus niet zo. Big data is gewoon heel veel data bij elkaar. Daar komt dat big vandaan. En wat dat big data beweging doet, is die analyses daarop maken. Van wat betekent dan die big data? Wat kun je eruit halen? Nou, ook niet heel erg nieuw, want volgens mij deed Airmiles dat al heel erg lang geleden. En weten ze eigenlijk nog steeds niet ook precies wat ze daarmee aan moeten met die veel data. Dat zie je dus ook in een zieltogend bestaan wat Airmiles leidt eigenlijk. Terwijl ze alles van me weten. kunnen ze daar toch op de een of andere manier niks mee doen. Dus big data, veel data verzamelen, dat leidt ook weer tot dingen omtrent data. Overigens, ook wat over gelezen deze week. Goed. Nog meer dingen van deze week. Oh ja, ik heb afgelopen maandag een masterclass Open Cultuurdata meegemaakt. En dat was erg leuk. Maar daar spelen hele andere aspecten over data. En dan ging het gewoon licenties. En we hebben allemaal data en dat data dat heeft een eigenaar en daar vinden we iets van. Als je dat vrijgeeft, dan moet je dat eigenaarschap moet je op een andere manier een afspraak over maken. Dat het vrij voor hergebruik is, dat is wat wij vanuit Opendata prediken in ieder geval. En dat willen ze binnen open cultuurdata ook heel graag. Alleen gaat het dan over schilderijen, portretrechten en over andere rechten waar je opeens over praat. En dan blijkt het heel complex te zijn. Dat je het plaatje van een bepaald kunstwerk, als het niet groter is dan zoveel pixels bij pixels, dan mag je het weer wel op internet vrijzetten. Is het groter dan dat aantal pixels, dan tast dat weer het beeldrecht aan. En als je een 3D-voorwerp weer onder een bepaalde hoek fotografeert, dan heeft het weer een uniek onderwerp in die, nou ja goed, het duizenden mee. Zitten hier mensen uit de culturele sector? Ja, ik heb met jullie te doen, echt waar. Dat is een complexe materie, dit is echt lastig. Wat ik wel mooi vind, is de energie die erachter zit om die data openbaar te gaan maken. Dus de wil is er, heel sterk. En dat is ook terecht, want culturele data, dat is ook heel veel data waar heel veel in zit. En waar we ook heel veel mee kunnen, wat voor de maatschappij interessant is. Om inzicht in te krijgen, om dingen mee te gaan doen. Dus ik ben er ook heel erg voor dat openbaar wordt en dat dat naar buiten toe gaat. Alleen, jongens, wat hebben we onszelf lastig gemaakt met die rechten? Goed. Is mij nog meer opgevallen over de data van de week? Big data, World Bank opent data. Heeft iemand anders iets hilarisch, iets groots meegemaakt afgelopen week op het gebied van open data wat ik niet genoemd heb? Het Big Data Forum in Almere. Ik was me daar niet van bewust, maar wil je er iets over zeggen, Ad?
Je hebt het net over een stukje Big Data gehad. In Almere hebben ze de ambitie neergelegd om Big Data Capital te gaan worden. Dus dat klinkt al gigantisch. Maar, ja, ze gaan daar volop datacenters neerzetten. Maar precies wat je zegt, heel veel big data bij elkaar gooien en maar daar ook snel kunnen doorzoeken, et cetera. Wat mij daarbij is gebleven, Dahoop, Apache is een sleutelwoord om door heel veel data heel snel te kunnen gaan zoeken.
René heeft ook nog iets meegemaakt op het gebied van open data afgelopen week, maar ja, wat wil je, dat kan niet anders als je zo'n evenement organiseert.
Ja, ik wil even speciaal aandacht vragen voor het belang van de datavisualisatie en de information graphics. Beneden op de begaande grond is een tentoonstelling en de aanleiding van dit congres over open data visualisatie. Ik denk dat visualisatie belangrijk is voor het democratiseren van data, zodat iedereen het kan begrijpen en lezen.
Zonder meer interessant om even te kijken wat hier inderdaad beneden allemaal staat. En terecht, René, wat je zegt, datavisualisatie, het inzichtelijk maken van wat is data nou uit, hoe ziet dat er nou uit, is super belangrijk. Ik moet wel toegeven dat als je gaat googlen op datavisualisatie, dan kom je wel eens dingen tegen waarvan ik denk van ja, die jongens die zijn eigenlijk gewoon veel meer met kunst bezig dan het feitelijk inzichtelijk maken van data. Dat is wel mooi. Ja, nog iemand met een open data gebeurtenis van afgelopen week?
Deze week, was gisteren bij de Hogeschool Rotterdam. Hallo, ik ben Suzanne Hansen en projectleider bij de Hogeschool Rotterdam, Open Data. En nog maar 3 weken, dus voor mij is het heel nieuw, dus daarom ben ik een beetje bescheiden dat ik het zeg, maar toch heel trots dat ik gisteren echt 4 studentengroepen heb gezien die echt een aantal weken achter elkaar met verschillende kleinere datasets van de gemeente Rotterdam hebben gewerkt. En daar proberen hele spannende, bescheiden, kleine, maar wel leuke applicaties mee te maken. En sommige studenten zijn zo enthousiast dat nu het vak stopt, dat ze gewoon zelf verder gaan in het stadslab, fablab, sensorlab wat we hebben. Dus ja, we zijn daar echt proberen bezig om dingen te maken. Dat wil ik toch even zeggen. Het is geen groot congres, maar wel progressie.
Ja, super. Het hoeft niet allemaal groot te zijn. Hè? Wat dat betreft, de start van veel dingen ligt hem ook in kleine dingen. We hebben nog een melding op het gebied van open data afgelopen week.
Ja, afgelopen week heb ik met mijn gemeente Vianen gesproken over het ontsluiten van financiële data in real time vanuit de systemen van het gemeentehuis, maar was heel koeltjes ontvangen. Ik wilde hieraan toevoegen, je kan natuurlijk de burgerparticipatie proberen te verhogen, maar als de data 1,5 jaar oud is, dan heb je er niks aan. De financiële data van 1,5 jaar oud is niks. Dus ik heb de gemeente Vianen voorgesteld om in real time financiële data te ontsluiten naar een aparte website, waar iedereen kan het visualiseren, bewerken en bekijken. Dat verhoogt naar mijn inziens de burgerparticipatie. Dat sluit de omkoping bij voorbaat uit. Dat heeft heel veel goede nadelen. Maar het is goede voordelen. Maar het nadeel daarvan is dat het waarschijnlijk een grote strijd wordt. Dus als iemand mee kan helpen, welkom.
Bedankt Victor voor jouw bijdrage. Nou, ik geef nog één iemand die een gebeurtenis heeft meegemaakt afgelopen week op het gebied van Opendata een kans. Ja, ik zie daar 2 handen. Dat is 1 kans voor 2 handen. Ja, jullie moeten het uitvechten. Ja?
Op dit moment gebeurt er wat met open data. Eigenlijk de gemeente Eindhoven had een internationale challenge uitgeschreven rondom open data en hoe je obesitas kunt bestrijden, voorkomen. En eigenlijk op dit moment wacht ik op de laatste uitslagen van de jury en dan is de winnaar bekend. Dus ook heel spannend.
Wat komt vandaag, die uitslag? Of, Kunnen we een leuke scoop doen? Dan zetten we het internet uit. Wie weet. Goed, obesitas data, dat is volgens mij big data. Goed. Dit was eigenlijk wat ik even ter introductie een beetje jullie mee wilde geven van wat mijn overwegingen zijn op het gebied van open data. Ik hoop verder door deze dag heen dat we door middel van allerlei inspirerende presentaties naar huis gaan met het gevoel van, ik begin morgen nog, mind you, zaterdag begin ik met het openen van data. Dus ga je gang. Ik wil het woord geven aan Adam Greenfield. Adam heeft met name op het gebied van smart cities het een en ander voor elkaar gekregen. En we zullen in de presentatie van Adam meer zien over. Ik had hem gevraagd trouwens in een paar bullets om zijn presentatie te duiden. En hij percipieerde dat als kogels, dus hij voelt zich licht bedreigd nu, dat zou kunnen. Another city is possible, the smart city from above and below. En het is de uitdaging om de smart city voor elkaar te krijgen. En Adam, bij deze, the word is yours. It's in English, it will be in English, so be prepared. Thank you.
No. Hey, there we go. Good morning. Nice to be here in Eindhoven. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that warm welcome. The talk today is indeed called Another City is Possible, and it's a way of examining the larger context that our concerns about open data are generally embedded in, the urban environment, the urban landscape, and particularly a way of problematizing and pushing back against the discourse and the rhetoric around what is being called the smart city that we are currently being offered by the large institutional players. You will forgive me, it's in English, and I hope that you'll further forgive me. I'm kind of at an angle to my presentation and to you, so I'm going to try and make eye contact with you. Forgive me if I stare off into kind of some vague space out there. It's sort of hard for me to figure out where to focus.
You want to have this mic?
We'll go with it. It's fine. So I think it's appropriate. I always like to confess my biases. I think transparency is really important to all of us. And so before I offer you a perspective, I think it's fair to offer you some evidence as to where that perspective comes from and say a couple of words about where I come from and who I am. I have, at this point, almost a decade and a half in information technology, and the particular sub-discipline or field that I started in was called information architecture way back at the end of the 1990s. This had to do with devising the structural and navigational design of enterprise-scale websites. And I did, between my work in the Bay Area and my work in Tokyo, I did roughly 40 or 50 enterprise-scale websites. And one thing that I was acutely aware of in all of that, never really left my mind, was that the reason that we were doing this structural and navigational design was to underwrite something that I was already thinking of as the user experience. And as an information architect, you do a lot of usability work. And one thing that you're exposed to if you do a lot of usability work is what happens when ordinary, everyday human beings encounter not even particularly high technological artifacts, but technological artifacts. And one thing that happens very routinely is that there's a failure of comprehension. There's a failure of engagement. And that fault is the designer's fault. That's not the user's fault. The trouble is that users tended to internalize the blame for this. We saw this empirically time and time again in our studies, that users would take on the blame for not being able to figure out the technological artifacts that they were being offered. They would say, I'm so stupid, why can't I figure this out? My 8-year-old kid can figure this out. The teenager who lives next door is conversant with this, fully conversant. What's wrong with me that I can't do that? And as a designer, that is not anything that I want on my conscience. I don't think that that is why I got involved in designing in information technology at all to begin with. I got involved I'm imagining the same reason that many of you are involved, which is ultimately to empower people and to give people access to tools and information, as the subtitle, the subhead of the original Whole Earth Catalog was titled way back when. Well, like I say, I did about 40 or 50 enterprise scale websites, and I got to the point where it was sort of algorithmic for me. It wasn't particularly interesting, it wasn't intellectually stimulating, it certainly wasn't creatively stimulating, and I began asking everybody I knew, what comes next after the web? And so this was Tokyo in 2001, 2002, and the obvious answer, the canonical answer that you would get in Tokyo at that time and place, was that mobile was the next thing after the World Wide Web. And perhaps it was a failure of imagination on my part, but at that particular point in time, mobile phone screens were, grayscale or green scale, more correctly. They were 4 lines of maybe 7 characters each. And I had a very hard time imagining the richness and the complexity of the world being channeled to people through that aperture. So I said, that can't possibly be what's coming next after the web. And I kept asking. The smartest person I know, a woman named Anne Galloway, said, there's this thing called ubiquitous computing. Perhaps you've heard of it. And I said, no, what's that? Tell me about it. She said, okay, well, there's this guy, Mark Weiser. Mark Weiser was the chief technological officer at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, the place where the graphic user interface had come from, the place where the Ethernet had come from. And he was possessed of a vision of the future of personal information technology that has proved to be extraordinarily prescient. Sadly, Mark Weiser passed away in 1999. He wasn't able to see the fruition of his vision, but this is what he saw. And this goes back to the late 1980s and early 1990s. He drew an arc forward from the mainframes of the 1960s through the personal computers of the 1980s. And he said the processing devices at the core of these powerful experiences are subject to Moore's law. So where you had a one device to many user relationship with the mainframe, by the time you get to the personal computer, you have a one-to-one relationship between processing device and user. And these require different ways of thinking about interface modality. On the mainframe, you can program it with punch cards or tapes or at the command line, and that's appropriate because with that sort of relationship between the user and the processing technology, you can demand a very high degree of education on the part of each user. As a matter of fact, each user is most likely also a developer. Clearly, by the time you get to the personal computer, that kind of assumption is no longer valid. You need to offer an interface that allows ordinary, everyday people to access the power at the core of that processing device. And that implies the graphic user interface. Well, so Weiser's looking at this circumstance and he's drawing the arc of Moore's law forward, and he says, well, what happens as processing devices continue to get smaller and cheaper and more robust? Well, guess what? They infiltrate into the world around us. Computation, information processing itself leaves these boxes and begins to colonize everyday life. And once again, since we have now a many device to one user relationship, we need a new and different way of thinking about the interface between this power and the human user. And he called that ubiquitous computing. So I like to read books. I find that I learn best by reading books. So I asked Anne, are there any good books about ubiquitous computing? This was already 2003, I guess. And she said, no, there are, academic papers and there are, proceedings of annual meetings. And I was like, okay, that doesn't really work for me. I need a book. She said, well, there really isn't one. So I had to write it. It took me a couple of years to do the research and write the book, and eventually it appeared as Everywhere, the dawning age of ubiquitous computing in 2006. It's been translated into a variety of languages. I'm afraid Dutch is not among them, for which I apologize. But it is an attempt to wrap my head around this emerging domain of ubiquitous computing, with the idea that if it was good enough for me, with my relatively low level of technical sophistication and comprehension, then it might explain some things to the general user. And I found it a reasonably satisfactory exercise. I feel like I learned a lot in the writing of this book. One of the things in particular that I became convinced of was that there was a natural home for ubiquitous computing in the world. There was a natural scale at which ubiquitous computing seemed to come to rest, and that scale was the scale of the city. So I became interested in what we first called urban computing, and later on, as I tried to shift the focus somewhat from the technical information processing aspects of this domain to the urban aspects, we later called networked urbanism. And I think it's fair to put this question mark up there, networked urbanism. What does that really mean? Well, honestly, I don't have much of an idea. I have some idea. We have weak signals. We only have weak signals because the world has only been infiltrated with these very powerful networked information processing technologies for, maybe a decade. So I think that it is fair to say that we are still very much in the process of finding out what networked urbanism means. Now, this was an endeavor that I took up towards the end of my interest in information architecture and the user experience, and it wound up culminating with a position for me at Nokia, where I was the head of design direction for service and user interface design for 2 years. And at Nokia, I thought, what an amazing platform, what an incredible user base, what a brilliant opportunity to leverage the power and the momentum of that organization to try and understand something a little bit better about the relationship between the data that we generate in everyday life, how everyday people perceive that data on a personal device, the relationship between these ubiquitous artifacts and the human beings that they're intended to serve. And I can tell you that I failed utterly at that endeavor. I failed at Nokia very badly, and it left me feeling rather beaten up, and I left and I went out and I started my own company called Urban Scale. It's an urban systems design practice based out of New York City. Urban Scale works in the terrain that is now being called the smart city. The smart city, this amazing new environment in which technology is brought to bear on every object, every surface, every relation that is heretofore in the 7,000 to 8,000 year history of human habitation constituted these dense sites of development that we think of as cities. There is one fact above all that I find salient about smart cities, and that is that par excellence they are still cities, which means that if we have in that 7,000 to 8,000 year history learned anything at all about cities and how they're formed and how they come to be and how they generate value for us, then maybe we can abstract some of that learning into this domain of the smart city. So I think a lot about processes of structuration and development, how order is generated, how meaning is generated, how value is generated in cities. And my thinking along these lines has been very strongly inflected by a guy named James C. Scott, who wrote an amazing book a couple of years ago. I recommend it to everyone who's involved at the interface between citizen and government. The book is called Seeing Like a State. And in Seeing Like a State, Scott argues that there are in fact two main modes of thinking about the processes of urban structuration and development. And he associates them very strongly with two symbolic thinkers. The first is this gentleman, the famous Swiss modernist architect and urbanist Le Corbusier, who, starting early in the 20th century, articulated a vision that eventually came to form as what he called the Ville radieuse, the radiant city. This was a clarification of process that had never been applied before to dense urban settlements. You can see here that there is absolutely rigid segregation of residential, retail, commercial, and industrial use, land use, in this vision of things. You can see that there's segregation of all of these functions of the city from the systems of circulation that feed them. Pedestrian traffic is segregated from vehicular traffic. And all of this is very, very tightly organized around a grid. A grid that, ironically enough, is only really apparent in the visual order, in the optical space. As a matter of fact, the Ville radieuse enshrines an order that wouldn't truly be visible to the people living in a city like this until the advent of Google Earth. It's a very interesting thing. He anticipated this. But this is an aesthetic applied to a city. This is an aesthetic that has to do with cleanliness, clarity, simplicity, order. It is very much a top-down optical aesthetic, and it results in places like this. This is the city plan for the capital city of Brazil, Brasilia. Although Le Corbusier himself was not involved in the planning of Brasilia, it is a Corbusian city par excellence. You get, once again, the very, very rigid functional segregation. The subordination of every process and function of an urban space to a visual order. Here, an attempt to draw a gigantic bird of prey on a plateau in Brazil. And if there are any watchwords of this way of thinking, this very, top-down way of thinking about the processes of structuration and development in cities, they are these. This is an environment in which watchfulness from above is the primary organizing principle, and the spaces themselves tend to be very strongly consecrated to the needs of administration, not so much of life or texture or everyday experience on the part of the people who live in these places, but the needs of the parties, the bodies, the institutions, and the individuals who administer them. And there's a very, very close degree of similarity between this sort of top-down way of thinking about cities and something that emerges from systems analysis and operations research in mid-century, this thought called optimum control theory. Optimum control theory was a body of intellectual thought that suggested that for any one complex problem, there was one and only one ideal solution, that all solutions were essentially could be generated algorithmically. So for example, if I was a city planner and I wanted to devise the square footage that I needed for retail in my city, all I needed to do was plug into the function, well, how many people live in this city and what's their approximate per capita disposable income? Given these two figures, I can generate a square footage that should suffice to the needs of retail for this city. And optimum control theory is curious in that it results, when applied to the urban form, in artifacts like this. This is an actual street nomenclature convention from Brasilia. Residential access way L1. It sounds like, the kind of thing you might see in a science fiction epic about people living on space stations who wear silver jumpsuits to work and have all their meals in the form of pills. I will confess to you, maybe you can tell from my mode of dress, I personally enjoy high modernist aesthetics, personally myself. I myself would have very little problem with living on residential access way L1, but I admit that this is a personal taste, and as a matter of fact, routinely, completely, consistently across space and time, consistently across decades, consistently across continents, the majority of people don't actually prefer this sort of very cold and orderly way of thinking about the places they live. They prefer to name their places after people that resonate with them, national or cultural heroes. They prefer to name their streets after trees that grow in the environment that the city was planned. They like for their environments to reflect something of the meaning that they associate with their environments, not have these very abstract, deplaced conventions of nomenclature and design. And so Scott eventually points out that there is, in fact, an entirely different perspective about the processes of structuration and order in the cities. And he associates that with This person, one of my prime intellectual heroes, the urbanist and economist Jane Jacobs, seen here in the White Horse Tavern in the West Village. Crucially, a social hub, a place where hard-drinking writers went to form a community. Here's Jane riding her bike in the streets of her beloved West Village of New York City in around 1961. And Jacobs, predominantly in her 1961 classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, argues that when you impose that kind of optical clarity, that order, that watchfulness from above, that segregation of functions, you actually destroy the implicit order of the city, an order that arises spontaneously and from below, that takes advantage, that leverages all that messy history that Corbusier wanted to sweep away. That order that is in fact built up over time by an infinity of small acts. And she gives an example, and curiously enough, it's an example about the security of a street in her neighborhood. It turns out that although this was not necessarily typical of the time, there was an incident involving a potential child abduction on the street where she lived. There was a man who had been observed driving his car slowly through the neighborhood. One morning, a young schoolgirl was walking down the street, and this man who had been noticed drove his car slowly past her, stopped, and rolled down the window and began to talk to the child. Well, what happened next was very interesting. Because of the structure of the neighborhood, because of its mixed composition, because of its mixed use, because of its mixed level of incomes, there were many different kinds of people who moved through that street on their own different schedules. There weren't massive fluxes. There weren't massive surges of traffic in the morning and the evening that there would be in one particular kind of neighborhood, a neighborhood that was only residential. This was a residential, a commercial, and even a light industrial neighborhood. So there were many different kinds of people moving through the space constantly on their own schedules. And as a result of that, people noticed this interaction between the man and the young girl. And as a matter of fact, people came to their doors. The butcher came to the door of the butcher shop. The postal delivery person stopped in her rounds. A person who was walking a dog happened to notice this. And one thing that we know to be true about the formation of crowds is that nothing attracts a crowd like a crowd. So from that initial grain of a few people on their own diverse errands noticing this, eventually a crowd began to form. And it was sufficient to intimidate this man who probably had no very good thing in mind. It was sufficient for him to conclude that he needed to get out of there. He rolled up his window, he drove down the street, he left. And that young girl was able to continue to school, and nothing ever happened to her. Jacobs argues that the order of the street, the organic order of the street, is a function and a consequence of precisely the fact that it was an environment of mixed use, mixed income, mixed schedules, people coming together, generating order over time by an infinity of small and selfish acts not directed necessarily towards establishing community security. They were just pursuing their own interests. And between them, they knit together an environment of safety. I want you to hold on to these visions, these two competing visions of structure and order in cities, the Corbusian vision and the Jacobian vision, because we're now going to discuss the smart city that's being offered to us. And I want you to remember to ask yourself which of these two visions resonates better with the visions of the smart city we're about to discuss. These are the visions that I want to share with you. The first is the canonical one, the city of Nuseongdo in South Korea. This is a city that was built from the ground up, literally on landfill, just south of the Incheon International Airport in the Incheon Free Trade Zone. And the guiding principle of Songdo, as it was developed by a private New Jersey-based real estate developer, was that information technology would be part of each and every aspect of the physical environment, each and every aspect of the social environment, each and every aspect of everyday life in the city. As you can see here, there would be things like biometric doors that would have iris recognition systems built into them. There would be robotic truck delivery systems that would be responsible for the delivery of parcels and packages. There would be mobile device mediated transactions. There would be dynamic pricing markets for parking. There would be something called the magic mirror, which is that very canonical sort of future prototype vision that you're offered by a bunch of companies where you wake up in the morning and you go to brush your teeth, and in the mirror, today's weather, today's news, and what you should wear when you leave the house. All of this wired together with a very, very elaborate infrastructure of servers and PCs and cameras and mobile devices, and all of it brought to you rather terrifyingly, as you can see from the Internet Explorer logo there, all of this ostensibly brought to you by Microsoft Windows. Already a scary vision right there. So it's interesting because this vision of Songdo has been promulgated long enough, it's been out there long enough, that we can begin to evaluate whether it meets its objectives or the claims that it's made for itself or not. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But Songdo is not the only vision of the smart city that we're offered. We're also offered this. This is the Intelligent Operations Center that the IBM Corporation built for the city of Rio de Janeiro, where big data is in fact gathered into a single operations center where it is visualized and abstracted, and analytics are applied to it, and even predictive analytics are applied to it for the purpose of managing and optimizing the flows of the city of Rio de Janeiro. It is, I think, incumbent upon us to ask, for who is this center offered? And it will not surprise you that, again, this is a way of conceiving of smart technology in cities that is for the needs and interests of one very particular subgroup of the city, less so for others. I think it is also fair to point out that a critique has been levied against this, that this is part and parcel of a program of urban pacification that is being undertaken in the run-up to the Olympics in Rio, where the favelas, the slums, are being cleared out, and that this is a way of helping the city do that. I don't know the city of Rio de Janeiro well enough to say whether or not that is so or not, but I think it's a very serious charge, and I think it's worth trying to understand what the potential and power of this sort of deployment of technology is, and ask if that is in fact the end to which it's being turned. Fortunately for IBM, they have somewhat more felicitous visions of the smart city. This is, I believe, a small coastal town in Greece that they're proposing to develop, again, on the Songdo model, with technology part and parcel of everything. Another large institutional actor that's very often invoked in these questions is Cisco. Cisco has a telepresence technology that they think seems to be core, frankly, to their value proposition as they discuss the smart city. So anytime Cisco talks about smart cities, they're talking about this kind of thing, this kind of telepresence artifact. I'm personally of the belief that this has more to do with communication and interior spaces than it does with urbanism per se. Nevertheless, this is part of what Cisco's offering is. Cisco also supports the Dubai police. Cisco, I have been on stage with a representative of this company when he discussed Cisco's ambition, in so many words, to put an IP camera over every building entrance in Dubai so as to help the police track the comings and goings of people there. He's very proud of that ambition. And a last major industrial player in the smart city place is, of course, Siemens. I think it says something that when I went to the Siemens website, I tried to find graphics expressing their vision of the smart city, that this is what I found. Kind of a Microsoft Word clip art pie chart that was labeled with some words that said that they care about environmental care, and they care about competitiveness, and they care about quality of life, and this is their vision of the smart city. This is the other image I found, which is looks like an architecture student or maybe an intern did some texture mapping of, I don't know, like solar cells onto a car from Tron or something like that. Not really sure, again, what this has to do with smart cities, but nevertheless, Siemens wants you to know that they're interested in this space. And a fourth institutional actor is much smaller than these others, in a way more interesting, in a way possessed of a slightly greater scope of vision. But well, let's talk a little bit about this company. They're called Living Planet. Nice little pun on IT there. That's literally the way they spell the name of their company. And this is a town that's being developed in Portugal called Planet Valley. Again, it's becoming a standard pitch by now. Every single aspect of everyday life, the living, the working, the socializing, is underwritten by data and networked information technology. Here we see that's not a hideous rendering. That's actually a fairly talented architectural rendering of a working space. So, this is probably the most concrete and coherent vision of the interior space of a smart city that is available outside of science fiction. Okay, this is the sine qua non right now of corporate visions of the smart city as they look like from the perspective of the people experiencing them. From my perspective, I like, what are those, Arne Jacobsen chairs? That's nice, that's lovely. I like things like that. I'm a modernist, I dig it. But I think it's important to note that they kind of wave a hand at what the smart in this smart environment is. They say, well, smart wall telemetry and like smart sensors in the floors. They don't bother to say what these sensors are or what they're picking up or what the telemetry is mediating. They merely argue that it's going to be there. And let's leave it at that for now. We'll come back to these visions. Those are the visions, that's state-of-the-art, 2012, what the large institutional players and one somewhat smaller institutional player are offering us as a vision of the smart city. I come from ultimately a background of cultural studies and critical theory. So one tool that I have in my intellectual toolkit is what's called a close reading. And I've done a close reading of the definitions of the smart city that are made available as promotional material by each of these actors. And you'll forgive me if I read these to you, because I think they're very interesting. IBM's description of the smart city is technology that synchronizes and analyzes efforts among sectors and agencies, not individual people, sectors and agencies, as they happen, giving decision makers, managers, consolidated information that helps them anticipate problems and manage growth and development in a sustainable way that minimizes disruptions and helps increase prosperity for everyone. So prosperity is at the core of all of this. Well, I don't have any problem with prosperity. I like prosperity. Most of us like prosperity. I don't really have a problem with that. This is Cisco's definition. The seamless integration. Mark well that word seamless. The seamless integration of public and private services delivered across a common network infrastructure to individuals, governments, and businesses. That's entirely reasonable. Public and private, common network infrastructure. Who doesn't love common network infrastructure? To individuals, governments, and businesses in what are, by my lights, just about the right order of priority. Individuals, governments, and only then businesses. The one problem I have with this definition is that word seamless. In my work, in my career, I've fought what appears to be a losing battle against this word. There's no such thing. Anytime you're talking about heterogeneous, distributed network systems, there is no such thing as a seamless handoff between one system and another. It cannot be done. And therefore, we are much better off not even trying to pretend that we can do seamless. Mark Weiser, this discourse actually goes back to Mark Weiser. He talked about something that he never quite defined, but he left us with this beautiful phrase, beautiful seams. So instead of seamlessness, let us try to craft beautiful seams at the juncture between two heterogeneous systems. I think that's a much better way of going about things. Apparently, Cisco hasn't gotten the memo. Let's take a look at Siemens. Siemens describes the smart city as several decades from now, so not now, several decades from now, cities will have countless autonomous, intelligently functioning IT systems that will have perfect knowledge of users' habits and energy consumption and provide optimum service. The goal of such a city, now what an amazing piece of language that is. The goal of such a city. This really got me thinking. I had never, in all of my thinking about cities, imagined that cities have goals. What is the goal of Eindhoven? Aside from, to remain here on this site. What is the goal of a city? It's a really curious way of describing things. The goal of such a city is to optimally regulate and control resources by means of autonomous IT systems. Well, is anybody in the room German? No? Okay. Maybe you can tell me about the cultural need for optimal regulation and control. I find that Germanic, Teutonic, I don't know. I do. I don't think that cities are about the optimal regulation and control of resources. I think that they're about other things entirely. Living Planet's description is the smart city is a complete picture of building state, very curious here, not anything else, building state usage and operations continually maintained, allowing constant optimization of energy, resources, environment, and here's the best part of all, occupant support and convenience systems. So everything that we encounter and brings meaning and value to our lives, the cafe on the corner, the conversations that we have with our neighbors, the way the sun filters through the trees, the way the air feels against our cheek as we walk to the train in the morning, those are occupant support and convenience systems. That's a terrifying vision of cities. Living Planet, however, is super honest, at least. They also describe the smart city as the missing link between the real estate and technology sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner. That is the most honest statement about smart cities that I've heard from any of these actors. It's distressing, but it's honest. Let's look at the core competencies of these organizations. This is IBM's laundry list of skills that they think they need to bring to bear on creating a smart city. But for some minor quibbles about the definitions of some of these things, that's great. This is, in fact, a reasonable approach to what you'd need to think about if you wanted to start understanding what a city is, what a city does. Cisco's, not much worse. Of course, they put their product, Cisco Telepresence, at the very top of the list. And their taxonomy, their categorization is a little bit different. But again, a pretty decent understanding of the complexity and the diversity of the challenges that a city offers us. You want to see what Siemens thinks the smart city is all about from a skill perspective, from a business unit perspective? Low voltage, medium voltage, mobility, and building technologies. I don't even know. I'm not an engineer. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know low voltage, medium voltage, and why not high voltage? I don't know. I mean, it's just. I find this puzzling. Let's look at Living Planet. They offer the Urban Operating System trademark. I find that in very bad taste, I'll be honest with you. I mean, urban operating system is a term of art that's been in such wide use in my domain for so long that they think that it's appropriate for them to go and slap a trademark on that. It's not playing right, it's not playing fair. They also offer the Urban Network Appliance, the Urban Cloud Appliance, urban transportation, and urban sensor networks. They must think that this word urban is just like the sexiest thing ever because they tack it onto everything. Who in this room, I mean, I'm not particularly technologically sophisticated, so who in this room thinks that they can distinguish for me what an urban network appliance might be from an urban cloud appliance? Are these separate and distinct things to you? Because I don't see necessarily the distinction. Yeah, whatever, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the smart city. That's the smart city. I think that there are a couple of problems with all these visions, to be honest with you. I really do. One is that a lot of them, the Siemens one in particular, but Songdo too, weirdly enough, despite the fact that Songdo is like an actual existing place, all of these visions exist in what the sociologists Paul Durish and Genevieve Bell refer to as the proximate future. The proximate future is that place where a lot of science fiction seems to live. It's kind of like 20 minutes into the future. It's just around the corner. We can reach it from here, but just barely. It's just beyond the grasp of our fingertips. And the thing about the proximate future that makes it a little bit dangerous is, I don't know, this is probably outside of your particular experience. When the United States went to war in Iraq, there was a journalist in the New York Times named Thomas Friedman, idiot, who would always say that the next 6 months would be the critical time in deciding the American adventure in Iraq. And, I would mark the days on the calendar and remember to come back to his column 6 months later and say, well, is it now? Is it now? Is it now? It's always, the next 6 months are the critical time. That's the proximate future. The proximate future can be endlessly deferred because there's never, you never have a marker that's put on the table, a bet that's made. It's always like there will be, in the distant future, there will be countless autonomous IT systems. What about now? I mean, municipal managers and citizens are both interested in now, not 20 years from now, although it's very useful to understand the consequences of the decisions we make now for 20 years from now. And it's certainly necessary to understand the long-term funding and investment that's necessary for heavy infrastructure. But what about now? Stop making promises about 20 years from now or 20 minutes from now. let's talk about the real world as it exists in real time. Another problem with all these visions of the smart city is that they take place in what the philosopher Deleuze called any space whatever. Abstract, unconditioned space at degree zero. Very literally, a lot of these places are built on what are called Greenfield sites. They're built in the middle of nowhere. They're built on landfill. Some smart cities have been proposed as floating pods on the ocean. And the luxury that this offers the planner of the smart city is that they don't have to take account of anything that exists, any of that messy history. The danger of it is that they don't get to leverage the intelligence that I would argue is in fact bound up explicitly and directly in that history. So it troubles me that when we talk about smart cities, we don't talk about Eindhoven, we don't talk about New York, we don't talk about Cleveland, Ohio, or Dusseldorf. We talk about, landfill somewhere. I think there are meaningful questions to ask if we are going to contrast two visions as to which of them is more adaptable to existing municipal procurement practices. I think that people in this room particularly will not be surprised to find out that it's in the nature of institutions that they like to dock with other institutions, and that it is difficult if you are a small player or an individual creator. You don't have the surface proteins to dock with municipal organizations. It's hard for them to see you, it's hard for them to recognize you, it's hard for their procurement and contracting processes to even begin to grasp what it is that you're building for them. But that's not really so much the real problem with the smart city. For me, the real problem with the smart city is this simple fact. Most of us don't live there and never will. Let's look at some of the most famous and widely promulgated visions of the smart city. One that I haven't mentioned yet, Masdar City in the United Arab Emirates. Masdar, all mod cons. I mean, like every single point of resistance to the idea of an infinitely luxurious and convenient city based on technology has been pulled out in Masdar. The population of Masdar projected to be 90,000. Planet Valley in Portugal. Planet Valley is being planned for 150,000. Even the queen of them all, New Songdo in South Korea, is projected for a total population, excuse me, of 500,000. Well, has anybody here ever been to Korea? Yeah, okay. So the Seoul Incheon Ansan Metropolitan Complex, thank you, numbers somewhere between 18 and 20 million people. In an environment of 18 million people, I have to say that 500,000 is not very much at all. Furthermore, I was in Songdo last summer, and it is up and running. It doesn't feel to me, like I lived in Helsinki. Helsinki was a city of 500,000 people. I think I know what a city of 500,000 people feels like. Songdo did not feel like that. I would guess that there may be something under half that number of people living there. So 200,000, 250,000 people in a metropolitan complex of 18 to 20 million people. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a suburb. That's not a smart city. So in our work, given that we recognize that we live on a planet of 7 billion human beings, and that if we're going to talk about smart cities, we're going to have to talk about meeting people halfway at least. We do this. We take advice from the famous American bank robber Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton was once asked why he robbed banks, and he responded, because that's where the money is. So at urban scale, we don't believe in greenfield development, and as a matter of fact, we don't believe in the smart city. Anybody in my shop who uses the phrase the smart city unironically is taken to the door and ejected swiftly and without mercy. We design for networked cities and citizens, as a matter of fact, for the cities we already live in. And we like to think that we're guided by this principle. What would Jane Jacobs do? Because if there are, in fact, two ways of thinking about the processes of structuration and order in cities, as James C. Scott suggests to us, then there are probably two ways of thinking about smart cities as well, since smart cities are still cities. There is the Corbusian watchfulness from above, consecrated to the needs of administration and driven by the algorithmic regularities of optimum control theory. And there's a different perspective entirely, one of spontaneous order from below that leverages and builds its value propositions on all that messy history, and that is built up over time by an infinity of small acts. What we see on the screen is a shot from a project done by a designer named Xia Huang, who, using the Foursquare API, let people map their Foursquare check-ins over time and begin to leverage the insight into not merely where they went most often, the clusters of the places they went to, and to draw associations between the patterns that they made in space and time and the patterns that other people made in space-time, so that emergent communities could crystallize out of solution. Order built up over time by an infinity of small acts, built from people moving through space and time for their own reasons, for their own ends, using an open framework with an open API to develop meaningful, actionable, meaning-generating knowledge and intelligence about the place they live. So there is another way of thinking about smart cities. There is an entirely other and separate vision of the smart city, and it has a lot to do with these things. My friend Anthony Townsend, formerly of the Institute for the Future, in a poster that he did last year called A Planet of Civic Laboratories, says that you need 5 ingredients to really, develop intelligence in a place that's oriented towards the needs of people and where meaning and value are generated from the bottom up. He says you need broadband connectivity, smart personal devices, open data infrastructures, public interfaces, and cloud computing. The first 2 of these things he never says cheap, but I profoundly personally believe that broadband connectivity and smart personal devices need to be had at either extremely low or zero cost to the end user in order to really get the maximum advantage out of the systems and infrastructures we're talking about. Let's talk real quickly about these things. Broadband connectivity, well, this is absolutely an essential condition. It is necessary but not sufficient. You have to have good, available, cheap up and down speeds to the internet if you're going to build anything of meaning and value on it. Obviously, some places are better at this than others. Obviously, some places have made this absolutely a cornerstone of their national innovation policy. For example, when you go to Taipei in Taiwan, you walk through the city and there are open and reasonably fast networks everywhere you go. When I'm in Amsterdam, by distinct contrast, I have a really hard time in Amsterdam because I've grown so dependent on data and connectivity, and I'm not going to pay for a data plan as a tourist. And Amsterdam, I have to say, is not a particularly generous city when it comes to open wireless broadband connections. Very, very scarce to come by there. And I would argue that that suppresses a lot of the emerging value and order that we're talking about. By contrast, it's relatively easy to do that in some other places. Korea, Taiwan, they tend to have adopted extremely good, extremely available broadband connectivity as a cornerstone of their national policy. But to use that connectivity, most people, again, this is the vision of ubiquitous computing to some degree. We're not talking about these devices. We're talking about these devices, or even information that's embedded in the environment around us. We need smart personal devices that are able to grab information off the network, that function both as an aperture onto everything that's on the network and as a sensor package to collect information and feed the network with it. We need, and this will not be problematic, I believe, for anybody in this room, we need open data. If you want to build anything of value, well, the citizens generate the data that constitute the data offering of a city. The citizens generate the value that's inherent in that data. Shouldn't the citizens be able to take advantage of that value? It is they that made it. It is inconceivable to me that we would allow our polities, the governments that represent us, to abstract that value and to allow that value to abscond from our lives. It is inconceivable to me. So I used to think, I'm writing a book right now, and I used to think that it was necessary for me to make this argument really strongly in the book. And one thing that I found gratifying and I think you'll find gratifying as well, is that I no longer believe that that argument needs to be made in quite the same way. Municipalities around the world have gotten the open data message. There are maybe 200 things that I would think of as cities that deserve the title of cities around the world. I've tried to kind of build a taxonomy of municipal open data offerings, and I've found to my delight that many cities do this, and they're quite happy to get on the bus. What I've found, what you also may have found, is that much of that data is worthless. Much of it is shovelware, right? Much of it is just like, okay, we have this, we're not going to apply any order to it, we're not going to ensure that it's in a usable form, we're not going to normalize it, we're not going to validate it, but here, have at it. It's open, it's free, enjoy. Again, not a way that I think is useful in terms of building or generating value. We also talk about public interfaces. The next two slides, you'll forgive me, are prototypes from my own practice, because even if personal devices are extremely low cost or even free, after all, not everybody has a personal device. And so in the interests of inclusivity, in the interests of social inclusion, and ensuring that every member of a society gets, at some point in time, to make use of the power that is bound up in this information, we need to pull that open data over the high-speed broadband network to a variety of well-designed public interfaces. What we see on the screen is the prototype of an interactive service for informational kiosks called Urban Flow that we were designing for the city of Chicago last year. One thing that I found in my work as I've gone around the world is that a lot of cities over the last 10 years or so have deployed informational kiosks, interactive informational kiosks, and there's one almost everywhere I go, I see the same thing, which is that they suck, right? Nobody uses them. Like, they get crapped on by seagulls, they bleach out in the sun, nobody maintains them. The ones in Bristol were great. The ones in Bristol had little printers in them that were supposed to print out the directions you'd get off the screen, and apparently nobody had ever refilled the printer paper, so people would stick cigarette or crisp packages in them, and it was great. So we tried to redesign these from my background in usability and information architecture and user experience. We tried to bring information about wayfinding and journey planning and local service discovery. So not merely commercial services, not merely commercial and municipal services, but commercial, municipal, and user citizen-generated services to surface that through this interface. And to do it all in a way that was fed, as you can see here, by real-time open data. The municipal transit data at the top of the screen was actually live and in real time. And we tried to do it in a way that was expressed through natural language. It was very important to us as interface designers not to drop this functionality on people's heads the way Google would, very bluntly, very engineeringly, but to try and understand how ordinary everyday people use and understand the world, and to tailor language to that understanding of the world. Here's another public interface that we designed. I don't know here if your transit cards are RFID based. They are in most big cities. They are not in New York currently, as it happens. New York is stuck with swipe mag strip technology from the 1970s. But we anticipate that most big city transit systems for the next 5 years or so will probably use RFID based touchless or near field payment systems before most of it goes to the device. And we decided that one of the things that's really irritating about that experience is that ordinarily you don't know how much value remains on your card. So all the time it's happening to me that you get to the turnstile and you go to swipe yourself in or tap yourself in, and you seize up against the turnstile, and the three people behind you bump into you and you miss your train, and that failure cascades through the rest of your day. Well, we figured that an e-paper display, the beautiful thing about e-paper is that it's non-volatile, and it only requires power at the change of state. It only requires power at the moment you actually flash it from one image to another. So we thought that it was possible that we could engineer an interface that actually puts a full surface active matrix e-paper display, laminates that onto a transit card, and is powered actually by the tap and the induction field. And we were told by somebody who knows what they're talking about that this was physically impossible, which is interesting because then we went ahead and did it. And I'm quite happy to say that this is now in working prototype. And that, again, it's a slightly different way of thinking about public interface, but this is a way in which data is generated by citizens and is offered back to citizens so they can act upon it. And finally, cloud computing, the idea that you pull processing off of the local device and wherever possible, put storage and processing in the cloud so you can make these local personal devices as lightweight and as low powered and as robust as possible. So these are the 5 elements that Anthony Townsend argues are necessary for the bottom-up development of meaning and value in the smart city, and I would tend to agree with him. I think it's important that I point out that I'm not saying no, but. I'm not saying we don't need the big infrastructure players. I'm not saying they don't have a role to play. But I am saying that you need both. It is not no, but yes, and. Yes, IBM and a bottom-up perspective. Yes, Cisco and a citizen-oriented way of conceiving of value and meaning in the city. For all of us who live and work and love and build and dream in cities, not just the administrative elite, not just for any city, but in fact for this city, wherever this city would happen to be, for each specific local place with its own local texture and culture and history. Not just any space, but space that is social, space that arises out of the interactions of people in communities. And if it is true what Henri Lefebvre said about social space, that it is in fact socially constructed, that its meaning is generated by a process of interaction between and among us, then it is necessary for all of us to approach these challenges together. I thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been wonderful to be here in Eindhoven. And I think we have time for some questions if you want to do that.
Yes, I want to do that. Yes.
Okay, super.
I've got a couple of questions myself. Is that a problem?
Why don't we let people in the audience?
Shall we start with the people?
Yeah.
The citizens?
I think that's I'll answer your questions, okay, but let's see if there's any questions from the crowd.
Questions? Who wants to start? Yes?
Oh, quick.
You helped us with 4 definitions from... We got 4 definitions of the big players of a smart city. Do you have a normal, a good definition? Do you have it yourself?
Yes, I do. I believe...
And not only the list of the 5 things as broadband communications, etc., but just the plain...
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to satisfy you, but I actually believe that every city is always already a smart city, and that the intelligence of the city resides in the people who make it what it is.
Yeah, I thought so, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for inspiring talk. Just one question. You never touched the real-time data. I think the smart city cannot be smart if the data is delayed. Financial data, transport data, shopping data, whatever. If there is no real-time data, it's not smart.
Well, okay. So obviously real-time is better, but we live in a world, we live inside history. We live in a world that's subject to physics, that's subject to entropy. And by its very nature, not all information is always going to be available with zero latency. So I think the most respectful and the best way to go about addressing that situation is metadata and design, frankly, about the provenance of the information that we're dealing with. And a very, very simple example of this is the indicators on bus shelters that tell you when the next bus is supposed to be there. They, right now, currently, around the world, invariably announce every bus with equal authority. And not all of that information is real time. Not all of that information is good. So what I believe is necessary is some way of indicating the confidence that we have in some given fact that's being offered to people and saying, does it arrive from one source? Has it been vetted against 2 sources? Do we have 3 or more sources? And what are our feelings about the accuracy of it? And when we can confidently say that this is an accurate piece of information with zero latency, then we represent it as such. But if there's anything that falls short of that, either in time or an accuracy or reliability, then we need to indicate that in the design as well. And we also need to offer information about the provenance of that information so that people can build up over time a sense of the reliability of individual sources, whether those be institutional or individual sensors. And then they can judge for themselves whether the facts that they're being offered are...
You're taking the latency as granted. And what I'm applying to is just building the information architectures, not the cables or Wi-Fi or whatever, but the software architecture which foresees in real-time data. Not anymore taking the data latency as granted, but building in the architectures upon real-time data. Then you never had this respite, it's latency.
I think that's utopia. I don't agree with that. I don't think that there's any such thing as a universal reliance upon zero latency real-time data. I think that we should build our systems to be robust to reality. Sorry, I disagree.
Thank you. Other questions? Is there someone here from Siemens?
What about commercial parties? Most of the things that you talked about not having network connection in Amsterdam, is in Europe determined by commercial parties and not by government. What would you say about that?
I think that it is the role of the government to provide a platform on which commercial parties can build their value propositions. I think there are obviously different ways of perceiving the value of government. I do not come from a neoliberal perspective. I think the public sector has a very important role to play in guaranteeing that everybody is starting from equal access to opportunity. What they make of that opportunity is in their own court. And they should be able to leverage and even exploit that for their own benefit. Absolutely, I'm not opposed to that. But I think that government is the only actor in our lives that has the scale and the ability to enforce open access and to make those value propositions possible.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes?
So I have a question about this tension between control on the one hand and the laissez-faire, the happiness of the city, the freedom of the city. You talked about the goal of the city, for example, but I think there is a time where there are problems to be solved that ask for some new kind of management. For example, how to manage a city sustainably. That have to be between laissez-faire and control, because if everybody follows their instincts and just have fun and consumes, then you immediately have problems with sustainability, energy-wise, ecology-wise, etc. How do you see scenarios coming up to combine the two, to actually have a goal of maintaining your sources sustainably, and at the same time maintaining the happiness and the freedom to consume and in a city the way you want?
So that's the right question, and it's a little bit external to the body of this thought proper, but I will give you what I think a good answer is. I think the wonderful thing about our network technology and the moment we live in is that it affords us the scope to begin thinking seriously about what has been called deliberative democracy. So not immediate up or down votes on things, but votes on things that follow an extended period of discovery and discussion. And I think that, again, with access to information, with access to data, and with talented moderation and a large degree of effort, we can turn our cities into places where citizens discuss things before voting on them. And small-scale management of communities that has used deliberative democracy finds that when these particular tool sets are put in place, the community has a much better ability to make decisions in something approaching real time that allocate resources in ways that are harmonious with the continued existence of that community. I think that sustainability is one of those things that it's one of my kind of core bedrock principles that we ask citizens themselves what the issues that they perceive are. You say that there are challenges that we face that require, that require new kinds of management. I don't disagree, but I'm very hesitant to a priori ahead of time say what those issues are. I'd rather go use the data collection tools that we have and solicit the will of the people and find out in any local community what issues they perceive. A challenge to that level of thinking, that mode of thinking, is that ordinary people embedded in their everyday lives very rarely perceive the connection between their own individual actions and large-scale emergent effects like climate change. I think that doesn't trust the insight and the intelligence of the ordinary person very much. I think people are actually pretty good at connecting their actions to larger consequences in the aggregate, in the main. And I think that if we develop not merely the tools, but the mindset that deliberative democracy is what we want to achieve, I think it's a very sound way of approaching those challenges, which are, as you correctly point out, of a nature where if we are all left to do what we will, there won't be any us here left to do anything at all. I think that's right.
Okay. A question I have myself is, are the design principles of a city, they are not really different, I think, from 7,000 years ago and now, because it are the humans who are designing the city. And the only thing which is different is that there is much more technology available now at the moment to help these people to create the new city, but the design principles they get in themselves is quite the same as it was 7,000 years ago. How you look at that?
Yeah, I tend to agree pretty strongly with that. I think I'll make a caveat. The one caveat I will make is that we've become bound up in a co-evolutionary loop with our technology. We are no longer simply human, but there's now this extended phenotype. There's this sort of, outboard brain, this collective memory, what Bernard Stiegler calls the global mnemotechnic apparatus. And I think that in important ways, you're absolutely correct, but I would also caution that as we become more technologically augmented, there may in fact be something new under the sun. There may be post-human or transhuman needs from urban places that are not what I would recognize as needs. Yep. I myself am very disturbed by the rhetoric of post or transhumanity, and I want no part of it. But other people will want that, and they may very well want cities that are different from ones that I would find congenial.
Okay. If you look at the development of Twitter, for instance, if I really dig down into what Twitter does, it does reflect the need of people to get into contact with each other around the campfire. It was 7,000 years ago, and they do have their own digital campfires at this moment. But the technology is different. So I think I'm really happy with your presentation, because it pointed out to me at last that there's all this smart city stuff from the companies you mentioned before. You should, if you really peel off the layers what they are saying, it's quite, I can't find really nice words to explain what. So I leave it here. Well, thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you for a very kind welcome. Great. Yeah, it's been great to be here.
Did someone not like the talk of Adam? He should point out this now. No? Okay. Then thank you very much, Adam. We zijn heel dicht bij de eerste pauze. Nog een paar dingen die mij opvielen op Twitter, is dat er iemand geprobeerd heeft een panty te stoppen met Opendata. Dat was Gabi die daarom vroeg. Gabi, is het gelukt? Waar zit je? Oh, ja, je gaat zo naar hem. Heel goed. Oké, mooi. Rob Bots, jij krijgt de sterkte bij je presentatie zo meteen vanuit de digitale stedenagenda. Die tweet kwam voorbij. Tom Zeppenveld, die gaat dadelijk een Ordex-presentatie geven. Dat vindt hij heel spannend. Tom, waar zit je? Ja, Tom. Ja, hoi. Ik denk wel dat het gaat lukken, toch? Ik hoop het. Ja, oké. Oké, nou, we gaan Tom nog even helpen met zijn netwerkprobleem dan, begrijp ik. Pepijn Lemmens, waar zit Pepijn? Ja, hoi. Heb je al genoeg argumentatie voor je gevonden voor je orde? Nee, nog niet? Tom die hoopt, nou ja goed, laten we hopen dat uit de workshops van vanmiddag er voldoende argumentatie komt om jouw organisatie te overtuigen. Dus we echt wel de bedoeling om jou daarmee te helpen. Pauze, koffie en volgens mij hebben we een kwartier. Ja, oké.